Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Rules of Attraction by Bret Easton Ellis. Now, The Rules of Attraction was published in 1987, and this is Ellis's second novel, his first being Less Than Zero. And yes, I know I'm in a different location than where I normally record my videos. I'm actually outside in my family's camper right now. My family's home right now, and I prefer to record my videos in some kind of form of peace and quiet. Now, The Rules of Attraction is a satirical dark comedy, and I want to say this is Ellis's first novel that is overtly a satire. Less Than Zero had some satirical elements to it, but for the most part, Less Than Zero was pretty much a drama, and it was actually a really grim and depressing book. This book is actually quite funny, and a lot of his books after this would have a lot of dark humor in it, so once again, I want to say this is his first book that is overtly a satire. Now, while the book is funny, it's definitely dark humor, and the book does have the same sense of nihilism that Less Than Zero had. Now, there are parts of this book that made me laugh my ass off, but then there are parts of this book that are actually really sad and quite depressing. So it's sort of a comedy drama, and it's a dark comedy that actually commits to being dark. Now, I've read this book a couple of years ago, but I recently reread it because I've read all of Bret Easton Ellis' novels except for Glamorama, and I wanted to revisit his body of work. Now, after reading this book again, it actually hit me a lot harder than when I first read it. Not that I've had any experiences like the characters in this novel, but this book has some brutally honest things to say about relationships and about sex and about the ways men and women look at each other. Now, of course, everybody's different, and not every relationship is negative, but Bret Easton Ellis said something about love that I thought was really profound. Now, I'm paraphrasing here. I don't remember if this is exactly what he said, but he basically said that love can be the most wonderful thing in your life, or it could be the most painful thing that you'll ever experience. Again, I'm paraphrasing there. I don't remember if that's exactly what he said, but he said something along those lines, and I think what he said about love is perfectly encapsulated in this novel. Now, on the surface, The Rules of Attraction might appear as a romance novel, but it really isn't. If anything, this is an anti-romance. Now, the novel is set at a small liberal arts college in New Hampshire during the fall semester of 1985, and each chapter in this book is narrated by a different person, but the book has three prominent narrators. You have Sean Bateman, and if you're familiar with Ellis's other books, know that last name is not a coincidence. And Sean is a drug dealer, and he's pretty much a douchebag. Like, he sleeps with all these girls, none of whom he actually has any real feelings for. But then he meets this girl named Lauren Hine. I think I'm saying her last name right, I'm not sure. And he actually falls in love with her, and he thinks she's in love with him. But then you get her narration. She's the second narrator of the book, and in her narration, you realize that she really doesn't feel anything for Sean. You realize that she's just sleeping with Sean to pass the time, and actually has a real dislike for him, and her dislike for him seems to increase as the novel goes on. And she's actually waiting for this guy named Victor, who she's actually in love with, to get back from Europe. And then you have Paul Denton, who is the book's third protagonist, and Paul is bi and actually did have a relationship with Lauren shortly before the events of this book, but he's definitely more gay than straight. And he has multiple sexual partners throughout the story, but he's actually madly in love with Sean, and in the book he describes sexual encounters he has with Sean, but here's where you get a real sense of the unreliable narrator. Because when you get Sean's narration, he doesn't even remotely acknowledge these sexual encounters with Paul, so you get a real sense that Paul is just making this up. And then to go back to Lauren, who's actually in love with this guy Victor, when you get Victor's narration, you realize that he barely even remembers Lauren. So really this is the story of a love triangle, but it's a love triangle where each person is completely delusional about how the other person feels. And as I said, while Sean, Lauren, and Paul are the three main narrators, the book has multiple narrators. Now, I thought The Rules of Attraction was an excellent novel. I definitely appreciated it more reading it a second time. Now, this is definitely not a book for everybody, especially considering that there are no real likable characters in this book, at least not in any traditional sense. Like, all the characters in this book are douchebags who have no real empathy for each other, and when the characters in this book do get hurt, you almost feel like they deserve it because they've hurt other people in the same way. But the characters are so self-centered that they don't even realize how many people they've hurt. For example, there's a chapter in this book narrated by a girl committing suicide, and it's actually narrated by her while she's killing herself. And you realize that the reason she kills herself is because she's in love with Sean, but realizes that she can't be with him. And of course, Sean never finds this out, and of course, it's not really Sean's fault that she killed herself, but that goes back to what I was saying, that these characters are so self-centered that they don't even realize who they're hurting. And the characters in this book are also very shallow and very vapid, and I can see why some people would be turned off by that, because you might be thinking, why would I read this then? Why would I want to spend a novel with people that I absolutely hate? But I think that's the point of the book. Ellis is very much making a satire on people like this. And the characters in this book are very hypocritical, like, they hate other people for doing the same things that they do. And again, they're just shallow. Like, the characters in this book very much judge each other based on how they look and how they dress. And while the book is very much a satire, Ellis writes these characters in such a way where you're not really sure if he's judging them or embracing them or simply just laying them out as they are. Now, while this book was written in the 80s, and you could certainly tell it was written in the 80s, a lot of what Ellis is saying about the MTV generation, which was his generation, I mean, he was only in his early 20s when he wrote this, but a lot of what he's saying about the MTV generation you could very much apply to our current internet generation. And again, while the book is saying some serious things, it is a funny book as well, but it's definitely dark humor. Like, one of the funniest moments of this book for me, and technically this shouldn't be funny because in real life this would be really sad, but in one of the chapters narrated by Victor, he describes himself going through Europe, and at one point in this chapter, he describes going hitchhiking and being picked up by some old geezer who molests him. Now, yes, in real life that isn't funny at all, but it's funny the way he describes it because he's so nonchalant about it. He just says, and I was molested by some old geezer. And he doesn't even remotely make a big deal out of it. That's what I thought was really hilarious about it. Another really funny scene in this book is in one of the chapters narrated by Paul. He's about to go on a date, or what he thinks is a date, with Sean. And then one of his friends just storms into his dorm room saying, we have to take this kid to a hospital because some kid, like, ODs, and fuck this kid who OD'd, I'm about to go on a date. And then when they take this kid to the hospital, the doctor checks him out and is like, I'm pretty sure your friend is dead. And then the kid just gets up, and even when this kid is clearly alive, the doctor is still saying, I'm pretty sure your friend is dead. So again, the book is a great mix between comedy, drama, and satire, and Bret Easton Ellis in general is sort of an acquired taste, but I personally really do enjoy his novels. Now, a lot of Bret Easton Ellis' novels actually take place in the same universe. For example, Clay, who is the main character of Less Than Zero, is a minor character in this book where he's described by most of the other characters as the kid from LA. But there is actually a chapter in here narrated by Clay, and he mentions Rip and Blair, who are two characters from Less Than Zero, and the chapter he narrates is actually quite hilarious, which is ironic because Less Than Zero, as I pointed out already, is a really dark and depressing novel, so it's ironic that the chapter Clay narrates is really funny. Like, the chapter Clay narrates in this book almost feels like a short parody of Less Than Zero. Also, one of the main characters of this book, Sean Bateman, his brother is Patrick Bateman, who was the main character of American Psycho. And Patrick actually does narrate a chapter in this book, and Sean would actually show up in American Psycho. Bret Easton Ellis wrote a book called The Informers, which was a collection of interlocking stories, and one of the stories in The Informers was about this girl who was sending letters to this guy named Sean. Now, it never says what this guy's last name is, but I always got the impression that the Sean she's sending letters to is Sean Bateman. And the character of Victor from this novel would go on to become the main character of Bret Easton Ellis' novel Glamorama, and I think Lauren also shows up in that book as well. Now, there's a character in this book named Mitchell who would show up in Ellis's novel Lunar Park, which technically doesn't make sense because Lunar Park was sort of a mock autobiography where Bret Easton Ellis himself was the main character, and all of Bret Easton Ellis' novels were just novels in the universe of that book, yet somehow Mitchell still shows up in that novel. Now, in 2002, there was a film adaptation of this book of the same name, which was directed by Roger Avery, who also directed Killin' Zoe, and he also co-wrote Pulp Fiction with Quentin Tarantino. Now, I've never seen the movie, but Bret Easton Ellis has said that of all the films made based on his books, that was the one that came the closest to capturing the spirit of his novels. But yeah, that was my review on The Rules of Attraction by Bret Easton Ellis, and bye.